Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the next in our series of Glasgow Talks brought to you by Glasgow Chamber of Commerce. My name's Stuart Patrick. I'm the Chief Executive at the Chamber, and I'll be your host for this afternoon. I've got a big thank you to give to our series sponsors, the Clydesdale Bank and the University of Glasgow's Adam Smith Business School. Have been steadfast supporters of the Chamber and this series throughout the past few months. This afternoon we have the pleasure of having Mark Logan joining us for a conversation around his recent report. And in the programme for government that the First Minister announced last week, one commitment that she made in that programme was stated as follows: we must keep pace with digital innovation. In doing so, we can help boost economic growth, drive innovation, and protect businesses against any future crisis. That is why we quickly commissioned Mark Logan, former Chief Operating Officer of Skyscanner, to undertake a review of the Scottish tech sector, giving us a blueprint to raise it to world-class status. We're now working to take forward his ambitious recommendations, including the establishment of a national network of hubs for tech startups, offering world-class training programs, intensive monitoring, and access to funding opportunities. I'm going to take this opportunity to have a conversation with Mark initially. I would warmly recommend that if you haven't already done so, you read through his report. It's completely free of civil service terminology. It's very elegantly structured, and it covers an enormous range of issues that involved in building a technology ecosystem. I hope you don't mind, Mark, that there is a Chamber article in the Herald this morning heaping praise on your work. We are fundamentally supportive of what you have said. Mark, as the author of the Scottish Technology Review, is a professor of computing science at Glasgow University, co-founder of Ipso Facto, which advises startups. He has a range of non-executive director positions, including with TravelNest, Swippy. He's a deputy president at the Data Lab Innovation Centre, but he's, as we all know, best known, I guess, at this stage as being the former CEO of Skyscanner. So he has been brilliantly positioned to carry out this review and to give us a perspective on what's required to set up a technology ecosystem. I'm going to ask Mark maybe 6 or 7 questions just to get a sense of what's behind the report, what's in the report. Then I'll open it up for everyone to start to pitch in and gradually develop the conversation in the hour that we have available. So let me start, Mark, just by asking, how did this come about? How were you approached? Why, and why were you asked to do this?
Well, thank you, Stuart, and good afternoon, everybody. It's very good to have you here, and thanks for your time. So to answer your question, Stuart, and anything I say here should not in any way be taken as a political comment. I'm here as a completely independent entity in that regard. But I think how it came about was that, and I was glad to see this, that the government, in the midst of the COVID crisis and managing that, obviously that continues, but in the very kind of darkest days of the COVID crisis, was taking the time to look up and say, well, what happens after this? And obviously the economy is traumatized by the events of the last few months. So the report was commissioned to look ahead and say, once we start to come out of the worst of this, where are the growth areas for Scotland's economy, and how do we stimulate those so they can perform to their highest level? So that was the rationale for why the government went looking, if you like, for someone to do this report. How they found me? Well, I've worked in this sector for 30 years, more or less, which seems like a long time when I say it out loud. And I've spent a lot of that time being told by some people in Scotland and some people outside Scotland that you can't grow successful tech companies in a region like Scotland. You just can't do it. And I've enjoyed being part of teams that have proven that wrong on more than one occasion. And therefore, I wanted to, after Skyscanner, continue to help other startups, young founders coming through, etc., and lots of young founders do the same thing. So I and many others who contribute to our ecosystem, believe that we can do a lot more than we already do. And I've been sort of lobbying that point over the last sort of few years since leaving Skyscanner. So the government found out about that, and Kate Forbes approached me on that basis. And I was very pleased to see that the remit I was given for the report was be bold and don't be afraid to offend us, in a positive sense, in a constructive sense. And I think that takes a bit of courage from government, because obviously a report that's critical to the extent that there are criticisms in the report is going to get met with additional political flack. So it was exactly the right pitch to give to anyone who's writing this report, and I'm glad that the government did. But that's essentially how it came about.
Very good. Thanks very much on that. And actually, I think just to set out some of the basics of the report might be quite helpful, as the report itself does, just to explain what you meant by a technology ecosystem, both the terminology, technology and ecosystem. Could you say a little bit about how you defined that?
Certainly, and I think if you don't mind, sure, I'm just going to share a picture which might help, especially if you haven't had a chance to read the report, and shame on you if you haven't, but if you haven't had a chance to read the report, then this might be helpful. So I'm just going to show a couple of pictures here, and we can dig back into some other pictures later if we need them. So, it's a good question, what is the tech ecosystem? Because it's a term that's used in lots of different ways in lots of different places. So at the highest level, what we are saying here, Stuart, is, if you can see that picture in front of everyone, an ecosystem, a tech ecosystem, takes those things on the left and it produces those things on the right, i.e. a stream of hopefully successful tech businesses, of which a reasonable proportion of them are scaled, in some cases to very large scale. So when we talk about improving the tech ecosystem, then what we're really saying is if you look at this picture again now, they're trying to do two things. The first is increase the rate of those startups coming through to scale. And secondly, try to reduce the time that it takes to develop any one startup to scale. There's obviously a minimum to that second attribute. There's a certain time it takes to mature companies, but try to bring that towards that minimum natural time. So that's what we're trying to do in terms of the ecosystem. If you look inside the ecosystem, then it looks a bit like this. So that's us going into that box. And really what we're saying here is that, on the left-hand side of the diagram, we have a relatively very large number of concept stage entities, people thinking of starting a company, and maybe one or two people in the proverbial bedroom or garage who might want to do something. Some subset of them actually form a startup, hence the funnel narrows. Only a subset of those move through different levels of scale. And it's obviously the case that not every startup should move to later levels of scale. So the funnel has a natural narrowing rate, but with reference to the final picture I'll show here, the funnel's natural narrowing rate is rarely the same as the narrowing rate experienced in practice. So in Scotland, for example, our funnel narrows too quickly. And the reason for that is, well, let's imagine you're a startup and you can't find enough engineers to move to the next level of scale, or you can't find the management experience to structure a company for the next level of scale. So we leak companies through the funnel. So the difference between those inner red lines and those outer green lines is what I would call the opportunity gap. And what the report is trying to do is essentially identify interventions and support that can cause those inner lines to essentially move towards the outer lines. So obviously it's a 90-page report and that doesn't do it justice, but that's essentially at a high level what we're trying to do.
And your stance at present for your analysis is that you think Scotland's in what you described as a pre-tipping point phase for a technology ecosystem. Do you just give us a sense of how far away from a tipping point you think we are in Scotland, and how you would, what happens when we reach a tipping point? How will we know that?
Well, it's easier to answer the second question first, and then that sheds some light on the first one. So let's do them in that order. So what do we mean by a tipping point, first of all? Well, an ecosystem that is past its tipping point is one where there's a sufficient critical mass of startups and scale-ups such that certain virtuous network effects start to operate. And there's really three main ones. The first one is that you can start to attract talent from outside the ecosystem into it. So that could be in the form of, for example, senior engineers, product people, commercial people, etc. It could be in the form of executives that have taken companies to scale. But when they start to get attracted into the ecosystem because of the opportunities within it, then the byproduct of that is that they strengthen the companies within that ecosystem. So those companies are more likely to grow to success and for that matter, scale, which in turn attracts more talent. So there's a virtuous cycle running there. It's a very similar cycle operates with investment. So especially as you get to this Series A stage, where companies are looking for £10 million and above to continue to grow, it's difficult to attract that kind of finance in a pre-tipping point ecosystem because the investment world is largely about opportunity cost. How much effort does a VC, for example, have to expend to filter and find the next investable company? And if that ecosystem is pretty sparse, doesn't have that many credible candidates for investment, then they just won't spend as much time looking in that ecosystem. But once you get past the tipping point, that reverses, and more investment money and more investment expertise, again, drives more strength in the ecosystem, which drives more investment money. And the final effect that you see operating is that people from later stage successful tech companies start to recycle into earlier stage companies. So for example, rising stars in a company like Skyscanner, to pick an example I'm familiar with, will start to circulate back into earlier stage companies in more senior positions. And again, that strengthens the ecosystem. So we'll know when we've got there because we'll see those network effects operating. And frankly, they don't operate in Scotland's ecosystem today. For example, it's extremely difficult to attract a Silicon Valley executive, or for that matter, a London internet economy executive, to come and live in Edinburgh or Glasgow, because if that job doesn't work out, there's not enough alternatives for them to go to, and they have to move their family back out. So the first part of your question was, well, how far away are we from that? And that's a very hard question to answer because it's not about a precise number of startups that causes this, or if there is such a number, I don't think we really understand what that number is yet, but we'll know it when we see those loops I just mentioned operating. I would say, though, that I think we're closer to that tipping point than we've been in my career, at least, and there's others here who've had a longer career than I have. But I see in the ecosystem right now, notwithstanding the trauma of COVID, more young founders coming through, and not so young. I see more talent and more ambition than I've seen in the ecosystem for a very, very long time. And therefore, that suggests we're getting close to that point. And therefore, I think that with the right interventions now, and that many of these interventions aren't glamorous, aren't big ticket headline items, but with the right interventions, I think we can move across that point.
And you felt it was appropriate to talk about a technology ecosystem for Scotland. Scotland's big enough in that sense to have a technology ecosystem that can be sustainable and successful on its own.
Absolutely, it can. And I'll reference another ecosystem that you might be familiar with. And this was the one that built 20,000 of the world's ships about 70, 80 years ago. And it was based around Clydebank, where I grew up. So, we're very good at generating reasons why something can't be done. But the vast majority of those reasons are false. And I'm much more interested in the reasons why things can be done, because whether in theory you can or can't grow an ecosystem in Scotland to the strength that we want it, in practice, if you believe you can, you'll get a lot further. If you believe you can't, you'll be right. So I vote for believing that we can. And if you look at ecosystems across the water, like Finland, for example, which is now, I think, one of the most high output tech ecosystems in the world, not just in Europe, then a similar sized population, almost identical. They went on a similar journey a bit earlier than we're doing now, and they've shown that it's extremely possible. And the amount of, just as one proxy, it's not the best proxy, but as a proxy metric there, the investment into the Finnish tech ecosystem in the last 10 years has quadrupled, and it's running at around about 500 million euros a year. So absolutely we can.
Excellent. At the risk, I suppose, here of asking you to summarise the report, but you've drawn out three foundations of the technology ecosystem: education and talent, infrastructure, and funding. And you put them in that order. And if I read it properly, you give them that order of priority as well. Could you maybe just say a little bit about each of the issues, just so that the audience gets a flavour of the challenges that you felt could be tackled?
Certainly, and it might be good to start on why did I put them in that order, Stuart, because a lot of people might say, well, that's the wrong order, that should be the other way around. And the thought experiment that we should run to test that point is, if let's say we'd £10 million on the table in this meeting and we could use it for something, should we give it to, for example, SIB or a funding body or a VC, or should we invest it in education? And I'll define what I mean by education in a minute. Well, we already struggle to find credible startups in Scotland beyond a certain threshold number to invest that money in today. We struggle to get our money away today. So we could spend it, but would it have the same effect if we took that 10 million and spent it on founder education, on increasing the supply of engineers into our ecosystem, etc.? My view is that we'd get a lot more deal flow if we did the latter. So that's why we rate them in that order. But that's not to say that none of them are important. They're all extremely important, but that's the order of importance that the report calls out. Now, what's briefly in the different categories? Well, in education, we're looking at across the education funnel, as I've called it. So right from school level, where we teach computing science, and that's not going that well for us right now in Scotland, through to university level, where we create great technicians, but we want to start creating a larger number of great potential tech entrepreneurs, as has been done in some of the world's best sort of tech-orientated universities, through to sort of founder level and beyond. And a test there is, if I was to walk into an incubator in Scotland today and ask 10 startup founders, how do you stimulate viral compounding growth? Or what metrics matter on retention, for example, then I wouldn't get great answers in many cases, but that's the standard Silicon Valley growth playbook. And we've got to know that playbook because we're competing with those companies. So we've got to be able to move as fast as they can. So founder education is important as well. And, we're not long on experience in this ecosystem, with some notable exceptions. We're not long in experience. So we've got to go long in education to learn from other people's experience to close that gap. So that's education. Infrastructure, which is the second category, relates to two main things. It relates to physical infrastructure. So for example, incubation resources where we can nurture our startups, but it also talks a lot about social infrastructure. And this is an often neglected area because it's not tangible. You can't cut ribbons outside social infrastructure. But it's equally important, if not more important, than physical infrastructure. And that's essentially what I call the market square in the report, where people come together in different forums, small and large, and learn from each other and learn internationally and build a sense of community and identity and ability to find each other. And the best ecosystems in the world, including the smaller ones like Finland, are very strong on that. And we're not bad at it, but we could be better. So both those areas are under the scope of infrastructure. And finally, funding covers a number of areas, as you'd expect. It covers grant funding, it covers investment and different types of investment through different stages of requirements of a company's growth, but it also talks about investing in the categories I've just mentioned. So we cover a number of recommendations there as well.
You actually make 34 recommendations in the report covering those foundations. And one of the things you say right up front is that it's actually important that all of the recommendations are implemented for the strategy to be successful. Can you say a little bit about why you think that, and also the extent to which you think it's likely that the government would deliver that?
Well, I mean, on the last point, it was great to hear the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary for Finance both agree with that point and endorse the desire to do so. The reason that I say that is for two main reasons. The first is that the recommendations make up a portfolio of recommendations. And what I mean by that is that they're balanced such that some of them have huge long-term leverage value. So, for example, the investments we make in elevating computing science education, so we have far more children interested in the subject, hence far more engineers, hence more startups in the future. These are long-term investments. If we make them today, we won't see tomorrow a sudden rise number of startups in Scotland. Later in the funnel that we presented earlier, there's investments we can make or interventions or recommendations we can apply direct to our current startup community, and they will yield far more immediate benefits, but they don't have by themselves the same leverage. So by combining the two sets, we get a balanced portfolio that gives us responsiveness now in terms of results, but also gives us growth into the future. And the other reason that I think this is important is because the recommendations are mutually reinforcing in most cases. If you do two of them, you get more than the sum of their parts. And that's been intentionally designed into the report. Now, of course, there'll be exceptions, and absolutely, if we did 70% of them, that's still really valuable. But, you know, there's a difference between deciding you're not going to do them all versus having to spread their implementation over time. And I recognize absolutely that you know, to your point about how realistic is it, that some of these recommendations will take longer than others. But, you know, I've found in life, I'm sure you have too, 5 years, 10 years goes past awfully quickly. And if you start planting the seeds now, in 10 years' time, we'll be looking back and saying, you know, didn't we do well, and wasn't that clever? And 10 years will go by in a blink of an eye. So I think we need to have the stance that we are going to follow the threads in all of these recommendations. And, you know, there's probably others that, I'm sure there's others that aren't in the report that we should also develop too. But we need to not just pick off the easy ones and declare success, because we'll get some benefit, but we'll be scratching our heads in 10 years wondering why it didn't make more than an incremental difference.
I suppose one of the areas in the report where you'd say, gosh, that is quite a challenge, but it's absolutely fundamental, is the ask that computing science should be treated in education the same way that maths and physics is treated, and that we deal with the issue of attracting specific, or specialist rather, computing science teachers. Can you say a little bit more about that and the importance of that, and has there been interaction with the education community to test out how feasible that's going to be, the appetite for doing that?
So absolutely, let's discuss that, and I'll just lay down a kind of context statement, which is at the moment computing science is in decline in our schools, and by decline I mean there are less students doing it now than there were 10 years ago. There are less teachers teaching it now than there were 10 years ago. Many of our schools don't have any computing science teachers, and many of our pupils are being taught by teachers who are moonlighting, no disrespect meant there, from other subjects, and all credit to them for pitching in. But if we taught maths like that, we would probably be somewhat concerned about our future as an industrial nation. So when I say we've got to treat computing science like mathematics, we've got to be embarrassed by what I've just said. You know, morale is falling amongst teachers for this very reason. So this isn't a nice to have that we can fix later. And I see a lot of articles celebrating the burgeoning strengths of Scotland's tech sector, even as we're switching off the water supply upstream. and eventually that's going to arrive at, on our farm, as it were. So this is a crisis, and we need to treat it as a crisis. So that's why it's in there, first of all. Now, that then leads us to the essence of your question, Stuart, is, well, how easy is it to move towards that treatment? I'm a believer that we tend to think that big problems need big solutions and small problems need small solutions. So we spend most of our lives fixing small problems because we think they're fixable. Now, I'd like to posit here that big problems can also have small solutions. Now, let's assume that I can't prove that in theory, but again, in practice, if you believe that, you get a lot further than if you don't believe it. So let's look at education for a second. Now, let's look at one strand of this. If we can't overnight suddenly triple the number of computing science teachers we have and start teaching it from first year, what are the steps to get there, and how do we make dramatic improvement in the meantime? Well, let's look at a couple of points. The syllabus today is boring, right? Really boring. And if you ask students, pupils, you'll get that response. The data tells you that's what they think too. Few of them go on to higher level from National 5 level. Teachers will tell you something very similar. And the reason it's boring is because it requires to be at a level where people who can't program can teach it. Now, that's a little like saying people who don't know how to do maths should be able to teach maths. And we've got to change that. How do we change it? Well, we upskill our teachers. Why can't we upskill and reskill our teachers? Bearing in mind that this subject changes far more rapidly than any other subject out there. If you qualified 10 years ago, you probably didn't build apps. But now that's where much of the subject is. You probably didn't know about cloud, but now everything's going to the cloud. So we've got to be able to reskill our teachers regularly. Why can't we do that? Well, because we can't get time out of the classroom to reskill, and we don't have a program to upskill teachers who want to. But we've got a whole industry of programmers that would love to help. So why can't we put a teacher swap program in place where once a quarter teachers can get out of the classroom, an industrial person goes in, teaches the class, and we've got a program to help develop our teachers, which lets us make the syllabus more interesting, which lets things improve there. We can change the syllabus, we can take things out of the syllabus then to make room for programming projects that those teachers can then support. And already, and I don't want to go into this in too much grim detail, but already with just a couple of interventions, we've made the subject more interesting, it's less boring for pupils, teacher morale is higher, and we're taking our first steps towards making the subject more meaningful and more represented in our curriculum. Now, there's more we need to do there, but my point is that it's not difficult to identify small steps that make a big difference, that create momentum, that then give us the fair wind to invest further, to do more, such as employing more teachers. So we have the resources to do this, and there's a lot of great computing science teachers out there have created lots of material in their own time for interesting projects, for ways to upskill their colleagues. So a lot of what we need is there. And I look at the Scottish Tech Army, for example, that had 2,000, I think it was almost 2,000 software engineers in similar roles during furlough, helping charities go online, creating PPE databases, etc. And I can't help thinking that kind of community spirit is a huge value for us that we could apply to this problem of giving teachers space outside the classroom so they can learn. So we can unlock this problem without massive difficulty, I believe.
If I move it on to, I suppose one of the terms that you've used that catches the imagination, certainly when it comes to summarising the recommendations, you describe a tech scalar network. Can you say a little bit, can you describe what you mean by that in the first instance and why that's important?
Certainly. So there's a lot of terms out there that sound the same. So I want to clarify a couple of terms. The two main terms that people might have heard around nurturing spaces for startups, one of them is incubator, the other is accelerator, and there's myriad definitions out there. But in practice, how they actually get applied is that an incubator like Codebase, as you might well be aware of Codebase in Edinburgh, and other places. Codebase will give indefinite tenure subject to certain criteria to startups when they're in their smaller stages, and creates a kind of market square environment where people can learn from each other. You know, a two-person startup can learn from a company with 50 employees and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't do any education of founders, and you know, that's a very important area. Accelerators tend to be different. They tend to be relatively short-lived programs, you know, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, that sort of thing. They tend to have an education element, which tends to be of the form of someone like, you know, myself coming in and you know, sharing some lessons and war stories. So it's certainly valuable, but it's not sufficient education, but it's more education you get in an incubator. So what we're proposing to do in the report is create something that's different or goes beyond those two concepts. So they're still valuable to have in an ecosystem for sure. And what you'll find in the tech scaler definition is that we have a place, first of all, to nurture our startups. Secondly, we have an intensive education program running for founders and founding teams, covering everything from the internet economy playbook, you know, business models, growth techniques, etc., through to basic HR hygienes. You know, an awful lot of startups blow up because of, frankly, incompetent basic management and so on, or don't know how to scale, etc., etc. So 6 categories, I think, are identified in the report. We also want to make those environments somewhere where all the meetups in Scotland can take place. There's 200 tech meetups in Scotland today, but a lot of the people who run them say, well, you know, if only I had somewhere to run them that was free, because, you know, we don't have any money. So that's the constraint. So let's use those spaces. Let's integrate some of our grant funding that goes on, so we don't put startups through 2 sets of hoops, one to join the tech scaler, one to get grants. Let's integrate that curation process. And crucially, let's make these environments strongly virtualized. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that for 2 reasons, we don't want to think of these places as physical centers where you can occasionally dial in to. You know, for example, if you live in Thurso in Scotland, for example, then the present definition of our you know, incubators and accelerators is somewhat disenfranchising unless you live in the right place. So, you know, if for example, a tech meetup's taking place, chances are it's not actually online. And if it is, chances are you can't hear much and the people forget that you're on the other end of the line, so you feel excluded, etc., etc. So let's stand this whole metaphor on its head, and let's make the tech scalers primarily virtual. So all that education I mentioned, all that ability to participate in the market square activities is seamlessly available for anyone anywhere in Scotland, and for that matter outside, because we don't want to draw borders just for the sake of it. And also there's some physical places to go. And I think in a COVID world, that's particularly useful, but it's more importantly, it's an enfranchising approach. And in a country that's frankly very small, with a very small population, we need to get the most, you know, leverage out of all of us together. We can't be building a strategy around one city, or, you know, those that happen to be fortunate enough to be within range of a tech scaler. So the concept is developing in that direction, but that's essentially what we're trying to do with it.
And interesting that you say there, can't really develop a strategy in the back of one city. And you might have characterised the position at the moment as Edinburgh strong, everywhere else not so strong. But you don't take the view that we should, say, concentrate all our resources on trying to build Edinburgh into an internationally recognised centre. You take a different view, that there should be respective roles for all the cities of Scotland. Can you say a little bit about that? And in particular, given that we are slightly biased and parochial at this side of the M8, at the very least in Glasgow Talks, your thoughts about Glasgow's role in that broader Scottish network?
Well, you know, I start from the simple premise that the starting conditions for talent are that it's evenly distributed in a population, more or less. Obviously, there's different densities of people, but talent is evenly distributed. And, you know, we talk about, you know, potentially Edinburgh as a centre, but I think people outside Scotland would laugh at the idea that a tiny city is a centre of anything. We've got to look at the country as a centre. we've only got 5 million people, and only a subset of them are applicable to this discussion. So it just seems to me, I mean, I've been involved in growing companies in Scotland, and if you pick any city, I'm not going to pick in any one city here, and say that's the centre, then you have a hiring radius around it which is pretty small, because people aren't going to travel to Edinburgh or Glasgow or whatever from too far away. So your ability to scale that company, the ability to hire 200 engineers, for example, well, it's basically not there. And if that centre starts to become successful, then the problem very quickly reaches the limit, because suddenly all those companies are competing for a very small pool of engineers. So it doesn't make sense to me that a tiny country like ours would draw that line. And, if you want another example, let's look back again to the Scottish Enlightenment and similar periods like that. I wonder if we'd said to Lord Kelvin or James Watt or Adam Smith, I'm sorry, mate, you're in the wrong city. This isn't the centre for science or engineering. I wonder how many James Watts are out there that we want to just switch on. And the answer is, of course, they are. The James Watts, the Lord Kelvins, the James Clerk Maxwells, and many others are alive today in our society. They must be, because nothing's happened in terms of human intelligence that would make that distribution have changed, certainly not to the negative. The problem is we're not actually accessing them and giving them the conditions and giving them a stage. So I would vote for treating Scotland as a centre, because let's not get delusions of grandeur. We can be a great country, but we're not a great big country. So let's use everybody.
Great stuff. I'm going to turn the focus to the audience in a moment. So if anyone wants to come in with questions, please begin to indicate that. If you would like to raise your hand, then I'll spot that on the screen. So just to give you that notification. Equally, if you want to ask a question on the chat function, please do that too. But I'll just ask one final question before turning to the audience. Funding was the final foundation of the report. So can you say a little bit about the nature of the funding shortfalls that you think we now need to tackle, and how best that we're going to go about that?
Sure. So, the first thing I'd say, Stuart, is that we need to again make sure we've got this right way round. We will attract the world's biggest funders when we've got deal flow for them to fund. So to some extent, the primary issues that we do a better job of creating credible, non-frivolous startups that can convince people they can grow to scale. The money will come the more we do that. For example, Skyscanner didn't seek Sequoia's money. Sequoia sought Skyscanner. So once we got to a certain size, so the primary issue is back in those areas I talked about in terms of education infrastructure, but absolutely funding and investment is very valuable at certain key stages. In terms of those stages, if you look across the stages of a company, let's use the familiar model of investment titles, sort of early seed or pre-seed, seed, Series A, B and C and so on. Then, the picture in Scotland seems to be that we have very strong angel syndicates, amongst the most developed in the world, actually. Now, what are angel syndicates? Well, there are angel investors coming together to have more efficiency and more leverage, bigger investment quantums. So that's great when you're at a certain sort of maybe late seed stage as a company. It does mean there's fewer individual angel investors investing. So that early seed money is a little bit difficult to access. And then the other area that's difficult is as companies start to get to the point where they kind of need to start scaling. So they're maybe looking for sort of £10 million Series A type funding levels. Then that's not as easy to come across in Scotland as it is elsewhere. And I think that's an area we've got to solve for, because it would be a tragedy if we had credible companies with solid founding teams that were ready to scale, but they couldn't access that type of funding. Now, people will say to me, well, just get on the train and go to London or the virtual equivalent of that, and that's fair enough. but the facts still are that it's more frictionful for Scottish companies to access that money. So, I don't over-index on this point, because I still think the main issue is, let's get the great companies to the point where investors come here or are attracted here. But those are the two kind of problematic areas that people talk about here: kind of early seeds and the Series A level. That we have some excellent options in Scotland for accessing public money through Techstar, SIB, grants, etc. So we don't do a terrible job here, and therefore I conclude that the main issue isn't funding. The main issue is the other things we've talked about.
Great, thank you very much. Now I have an opportunity to turn to the audience, and I see Ian Ritchie there is actually holding up his hand, and actually, because I can see a few, I just happened to spot Ian doing that. So Ian, would you like to ask your question first? Oh, can we unmute Ian?
That's it. Okay. Yeah, Mark, I've been doing this sort of stuff for 40 years, and your report is head and shoulders above the shelf full of reports I've got over there. So thanks for that. Congratulations. One issue I wanted to home in on is your recommendation 17 about attracting executives to Scotland. The world in Scotland today is not like it was 20 years ago. We don't have corporate headquarters anymore. There's no Scottish Brewers, there's no Scottish Power, there's no Bank of Scotland, no Royal Bank. We just don't have corporate headquarters anymore. And so a lot of people who graduate in Scotland or come to Scotland to study have to go elsewhere to build a career. And in their 30s, they've actually got 10 years of management experience. And we need to get those people back. I know you can say you can train people, but you can't train people with 10 years of experience. You can't do that. And we also know that people in their mid-30s are much more successful building new companies or building companies than people in their 20s. I was on the board of Scottish Enterprise. We had Enterprise Fellowships, which you'll know about, that does tons of postdocs. But we did experiment a little bit with industrial fellowships. And we took people from industry and we supported them into transferring them into new sort of startup situations. And I don't know if that's something we could do again, or there's other ways of doing it, but we desperately need to get some good management talent back in Scotland.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and congratulations on your phenomenal contribution to our ecosystem. It's an honour to take a question from you, so thanks for your time today. I absolutely agree. And I talk about in the report that we have to go long in education because we're short on experience. But I would absolutely agree with you that you can't do without experience. You have to attract experience back in, and I think the root issue we have there is executives, be they exiled Scots or non-exiled Scots, they'll hesitate, even if it's a really attractive company in Scotland, they'll hesitate to up their family and move to Scotland. Because as you know, Ian, the failure rate of executive hires is quite high. It's a difficult hire to get right from both sides, and they know that. And if they think that if they move to London from Silicon Valley and it doesn't work out in delivery, but they can go to TransferWise, that's fine. But in Scotland, we don't have those riches, so people tend not to come in the first place. I remember in Skyscanner, we found that when we got past 500 people and we needed experienced VPs of engineering and so on, we just couldn't get them to come to Scotland, and we had to open an office in London. So I'd be up for exploring any mechanisms, and you've mentioned a couple there. The report looks at a couple of others, but I think we've got to treat this as a major issue. And I know it's a politically slightly unpalatable issue depending on how you treat it, but we have to recognise that we will not get to scale in our companies unless we can solve this problem. And that's why I talk again about money here isn't the issue. We could give any one of our small scale-ups £10 million, but they can't hire the management talent. They're just going to open offices in London, and 10 years down the line, you'll find the office is where all the action is, and the Edinburgh or Glasgow office is diminishing in size because those executives will hire around them. So I think it's a category one issue, and I'd be all up for putting our best thinking on the different ways we could solve it.
Beg your pardon, I was muted there. Thank you very much, Ian, and thanks for that, Mark. A question from Zhang Li. What's your view, and this is very specific because, of course, one of our sponsors is relevant here. What's your view on the role that a business school can play in Scotland's tech ecosystem?
So it's a great question, Shang. So I talk about in the report that I call it the social network problem. I don't know if everyone's seen the social network maybe, but you could define the start of it as a couple of business school students have a good idea for a social network, and Mark Zuckerberg steals it from them, but he can code. And a lot of business school students have seen that movie, and they're very reluctant to talk to computing scientists in case they steal their idea as well. And I'm not entirely joking there. But my serious point is that at university level, and I'm not suggesting that students should not finish their degrees and should go and start Googles and all that. It'd be lovely if some of them managed to do that. But university is an opportunity to meet people with different skill sets and to learn that teams are much stronger together than individuals are apart. And I could probably categorize the business school computing science relationship among students as computing scientists know how to code so they can develop prototypes of ideas, but they haven't got that many ideas. I mean, we've got some, that's no disrespect whatsoever to them. Business school students are just brimming full of business ideas, but have no ability to prototype them. And if you get these people together, they'll learn a lot at university. Some of them might even come up with great ideas together. They can move forward, but they'll learn a lot about how to operate in later life. So I think one thing that business schools can do is with other schools and universities is collide their students, not once a year in a kind of token, a summit exercise, but regularly, really intertwine those student groups. That's one thing that they can do. I think the other thing that business schools can do is, people often say universities don't do enough industrial or entrepreneurial teaching and shame on the academics, et cetera, but being an academic is a really tough job, actually. You've got a huge teaching responsibility, and you've got a lot of KPIs around research, et cetera. So I'm not expecting academics to teach entrepreneurialism to our students, fully. I think the business schools can be a great way of sucking in industry knowledge and placing industry people, not just inside the business school, but across the universities, because the business schools are much closer to that than many other schools are. So I think the business schools should be leading us on infusing into our universities lots of industrial people and spreading the kind of business drive across schools. So that's not seen as the sole province of the business school, but rather the business school is an enabler of entrepreneurialism across all the other schools, in addition to its core responsibilities, of course.
Great stuff. Can I bring in Fiona Godsman?
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. So Scottish Institute for Enterprise, we work with all of the universities and we work with entrepreneurial students. And actually, we see the strongest ideas often come from students who are not business school students or not computing students, but absolutely they all bring something, the idea of this multidisciplinary teams. So I would like to see more recognition, certainly at the very, very early stage, of ideas coming from anywhere and what the technology companies and the technology kids can actually do to enhance and turn these ideas into reality. So what would you agree?
No, I absolutely agree with that, Fiona. And I used business schools as an example because the question related there. But for example, we've got great ideas come out of the bio parts of our universities. Great ideas come out of the design part, and I think when you put design students alongside those two groups I just mentioned, great things can happen. So I absolutely believe that I talked about market squares earlier, and the universities are in a great position to create those market squares. And to say a thing about market squares for a moment, we often hear stories about the great Renaissance cities. And you've got to ask yourself, why were there all those geniuses in Florence at the same time, for example. And the answer is there wasn't. There was no more or less than any other time or any other major city, but the conditions were right. And literally, Leonardo da Vinci stepped outside of his house onto a square in Naples or Florence. Literally, that was a market square where other polyglots, polymaths, were also there, and they were exchanging ideas. Here's my latest thinking in mathematics. It will help you build that dome, etc., etc. And I think we've got to recreate those Renaissance conditions in our cities, and not least in our universities. And I think that's absolutely about colliding not just business school students or computing science students, but many others. I think computing science students are potentially important here because a lot of what any company wants to do nowadays requires some software engineering. So I think they do have an enabling role, but equally I would love more of our students, regardless of discipline, to be able to basically program computers or do prototyping, So there's a lot more that can be done there, but I completely agree with your point that this is a multidisciplinary point.
I suspect we have another audience member who would agree with your whole view on Renaissance and the role of the market square. I can see Sir Tom on the screen there, and I know that he has certainly made some very cogent remarks about the Scottish Enlightenment and the role that it played in Scotland's growth. If I can bring in, actually I'll take a question here. Marjorie McConnell has asked, welcome your thoughts on how well the community in Scotland understand their potential markets, local, UK, global, for what innovation they would build. What other skills ought we to equip our children with to add to this dimension?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think that, for the first part of the question, that really you have to, knowing what the market needs and knowing how to address a market need is a skill that needs to be learned like any other. We often, sort of glorify, Steve Jobs type people who just had this insight and so on. But I think even Steve Jobs would have told you that he had to learn how to be good at that. And I think we can teach that by practice. And, really the essence of entrepreneurialism is spotting a problem that needs to be solved and figuring out how you can practically solve it. Jack Ma, is obviously a legendary Chinese entrepreneur, talks about the great thing about problems is they create opportunities to start a business. And I think we've got to practice that from an earlier age in Scotland. I suspect there was a time when life was sufficiently hard in Scotland that you kind of needed to be an entrepreneur from 7 years old to help feed your family. And some subset of those people went on to start businesses and so on. I think we need to reinstill a similar approach. So I think that's key. I think without that, I've worked in startups and I've seen plenty of other startups had no clue what their market wanted, no clue what their product should do, and failed. And that's one way of getting experience. But if we can start that clock earlier, I'd vote for that.
I suspect you don't mean that we want 7-year-olds to feed their families, but I think we get what you mean.
Yeah. But once they did, once the mother would sit down at 6 a.m. and say, "You go and get some money somehow by selling something," and it wasn't that long ago, and I'm not wishing we could go back to those difficult times. But we need to recognise that entrepreneurialism can be taught and can be elevated, and the only way you get good at anything, any language, is by using it, and this is a language.
Gordon Kennedy asking, to what extent the growing focus on innovation districts and innovation centres could be helpful in this regard?
Well, it can go one of two ways. It can be completely neutral and have no effect at all, or we can harness the focus it brings to the word innovation. But any physical place, be it an innovation district or an incubator or any other or a new building on a campus in a university, no matter what we call those buildings, no matter where or not it's got the word innovation, physical static structures are not enough. It's the dynamics that we put in those places that matters. And that then raises the question of, well, what are the dynamics? And that's really what the report is trying to answer. So it's great, it's great to have the recognition from city level and at country level that innovation is important, and there's a will to support it. I think that's hugely helpful. But now we've got to get the dynamics working in those places.
Great stuff. And there's a couple of COVID-related questions. One from Whitney Zimmerman, or a comment rather, saying it's key to embrace the changes COVID has affected on remote working to increase our ability to hire executives who are willing to work remotely, at least at first. And then a question actually from Andrew McGee: how can we take advantage of the virtual world we're in to implement more of your recommendations more rapidly via Tech Scaler Network? Comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's two really timely questions. So, it's interesting. I work with quite a large number of startups, and in several of those startups, there's been debates pre-COVID about should we let people work from home and how much, and will people be productive, and the unspoken comment is, can we trust them, and all that kind of stuff. And all of those startups reported to me after they were forced to work from home that the productivity of their engineering teams doubled, more or less. And they were somewhat stunned by this. Now, there's no real magic there. It's simply that if you give engineers contiguous hours without interruption, they're just far more productive. That's been known since the 1960s, but we try to instantiate that model by having everyone in an office, and offices are noisy and meetings happen and so on. So I don't think any of those companies, even if they could tomorrow go back to normal, would exactly go back to normal. I think we'd see some type of hybrid working going forward. And I think that in some sense is a breakthrough. Now, more widely, if what this means is that we've, as a species or as a society or an international society, got over our fear of home working, and there's disadvantages and advantages to that, just as us within an office. But if we've got over our basic primal fear of doing it, then what opportunities does that create? Well, I think on its own, none, unless we do other things. So, for example, if we can put Scotland on the map as an international tech centre, so i.e. the companies in Scotland are companies you should work with, then we can hire people from anywhere. So I think if we don't put it on the map, people won't even think of us. So there's no reason why we can't have people within a few time zones working for Scottish companies going forward. I think another interesting thing to look at is someone said to me recently, will this mean that all of our Scottish folks who might otherwise work in Scottish companies will now go and work for companies abroad but live in Scotland? And I think we'll be the net beneficiaries, even if a lot of them do, because already you get on that early morning flight to London pre-COVID, it was full of Scots going off to London for the week. At least if they're living in Scotland, they're still contributing to our social market square. And I think they're more likely to come across companies to work with here. So I think overall Scotland will be a net beneficiary of this move, because our physical inaccessibility, as it were, reduces. It means more of our people can stay here physically, even if they want to work elsewhere, and they're more likely to collide with startup opportunities here, etc. So yeah, I think it's a positive, but it'll really help us if we can make Scotland appear on the map in terms of this is a great place to, has great companies to work in, regardless of where you're based.
Great, and I'm going to wind it up at that. So apologies for those who have submitted questions on chat function that I haven't been able to get to. We'd be delighted to keep a dialogue going with Mark for those that would particularly want to pursue questions with him. I'm sure Mark wouldn't mind if there were any questions we sent to him that he might want to be answering. But at this stage, if there's one thing that I do miss through doing virtual sessions, it's the ability to give someone a round of applause at the end of the session. We're not able to do that, but I personally would like to give Mark a big round of applause for not just for joining us this afternoon and giving us their insights into the report, but actually for delivering the report in the first place, because it is a fabulous, as Ian was saying, a fabulous document, and we are very keen to help get it delivered. I'd also like to thank Robert Gibson at Clydesdale Bank and John Finch at the Adam Smith Business School. We really enjoy working with you on this series. The next Glasgow Talks is on September 22nd with Gillian Docherty, Chief Executive of Data Lab, who happens also to be our Deputy President. We're very lucky to have her in the the Chamber family. So she's going to lead us through her thoughts on September the 22nd. In the meantime, can I therefore thank Mark again and thank everybody for joining us this afternoon at Glasgow Talks. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let us know and indeed steer us as you wish on topics and issues you'd like us to tackle in the series in the future. In the meantime, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you again soon.